After the first moves already so used to, we're going to now discuss one of the other important plans for black. One question that many of you might have had is, well, why doesn't black just at some point play for the d5 break, trying to eliminate the powerful white pawn on e4? And this is exactly what this video is about. This game was played between Giri and Anand in Norway, and after the moves d6, c3, so far so good, everything that we know of, black played a6. The move a6, as we had seen, is aimed at making sure the bishop has some room to retreat. And after a couple more normal moves, bishop to b3, this is another very common idea. The idea of this move is that if white does not play bishop to b3, if he just were to do something, then black can go bishop e6 and force the bishop trade. Because unlike in the second video, white does not have bishop to b5 anymore. And so, well, he'll have to accept a trade in one way or another. And so the move bishop to b3 is aimed at making sure the bishop ends up saved. Now black castled, and after a few more natural developing moves, black hit the bishop in advance, just like he did in the first video. We had seen h3, preventing any kind of knight g4 or bishop to g4, and now rook to e8. White harassed his bishop a little bit, retreated, some repetition happened, and then the knight started coming over to the king side. We've seen all the stuff before in one way or another, so I did not focus too much on these moves. Now comes the absolute central moment of this video. Black here decided, instead of just continuing quiet positional play with moves like knight e7 or queen d7 or whatnot, he decided to instead act actively and play in the center by playing the move pawn to d5. Now, obviously the idea is to try to threaten this pawn, potentially exchange, potentially even trade queens. However, there are some downsides to this move, and here's one of them. After e takes d5, now this pawn on e5 becomes a lot more vulnerable. Now, black has to figure out what piece does he want to take with on d5. Now, potentially all the captures are reasonable. In this game, he decided to take with the bishop, which has a big downside, and that is that the square on f5 becomes a lot more lonely, and this is something white managed to take advantage of, as we will see. Now, one theme you absolutely want to see is that if black takes, for example, with the knight, it might look as though this pawn is already under attack and white can just win it for free. However, that would be a very expensive mistake for you to assume. If white were to take on e5, black would have a very common theme you absolutely want to know, which is to capture, and then exploit the fact that this rook is undefended by playing this very, very nice move. Maybe you actually want to pause the video for a bit and try to find a tactic for black here, please. Okay, I hope you gave it some thought. So the rook is undefended, and this bishop on a7, which hid there all the way back in the jungle, can actually turn out to be the hero of the day and be sacrificed on f2. The point being, after white takes, black has a check, and now the king and the rook are under attack, and white loses. So this is a very important theme worth knowing. Importantly though, this only works if the black queen can go to f6. And so, if you were to just continue developing, which is what white wants to do anyway, and black were to just make some move like that, white can now take a free pawn because at this point, there is no sequence of this kind, since there is no check. So this is a very important difference for you to be able to tell you do not want to be winning this pawn on some occasions, but on some you do want this pawn. So make sure to do a little bit of reviewing when and why taking this pawn is good and bad. Now, going back, black decided to capture on d5 with the bishop. White just continued knight to g3 and here queen to d7. So remember, one of the downsides here is that black cannot control this square as well as he used to, as I had said before. But it looks like his previous move is aimed just at that, at making sure white cannot play knight f5. Now, how would you try to still accomplish our objective of going knight to f5? Okay, I hope you gave it some thought. The very typical move you want to make here as white is knight to h4. Now, one more very important theme worth knowing. If you were to at some point place your knight on h4 with the black queen on d8, in this exact position there will be no consequences. However, the knight is undefended, and very often if there is something that can be taken by this knight, like a pawn here or something, very often black takes it and then just wins a pawn because he gives up a knight and wins a pawn and then wins a free knight. So you want to make sure if you ever place a knight here on the edge, you want to make sure it either cannot be attacked or there is no consequence for leaving it hanging. Now, white continued knight to g3, queen d7, knight h4. The knight's coming over. Of course, here there are no tactical patterns because, well, there is no queen controlling h4. Black went rook to d8, and now Giri continued with the move knight f5. Black moved the king away to h8. The point of this move is that on some occasions white could, for example, play bishop takes h6 and then take, and it's a check. And Anand thought, well, let's just make sure there is no check. So he retreated with the king, and now Giri made a very interesting decision. There's already a bunch of sacrifices that are really worth considering here, such as knight takes g7, or knight takes h6, or bishop takes h6, and definitely this is something worth calculating. But one thing that you might want to remember is that we had discussed in the beginning of this video, I had shown to you that white had continued with bishop to b3 back in the day, right? Here white made sure black could not exchange his bishop. And now going back to this position, Giri thought, hey, I really want this is one of the most important, most influential pieces in the Rai Lopez and in the Italian, both in Gioco Piano and in the dynamic lines. And he thought, hey, I really want this piece to work. And so before any sacrifices, he played the move pawn to d4. This move might have seemed a little mysterious because it looks like, well, isn't it just, putting the pawn under a lot of pressure? And it is, but the main goal is to make sure this bishop is able to work. And now, after black captured, he decided to go all in with the tactics. What kind of ideas come to mind here as white? Make sure to take your time and calculate, and then you can resume watching the video. Okay, now I'm going to show the answer. So white is still not winning by force. Black is objectively doing all right if he finds all the incredible defenses. But white's able to make the opponent's life really difficult by playing the move knight takes on g7. Now the idea would be, of course, to bring one more knight to f5. And here, unfortunately for Anand, he was not able to find a way to survive. So amazingly, it appears as though blocking this bishop at some point with such a precise move as d3 could have been really important. And then after the bishop takes, the bishop could become a victim of some tactical consequences here. And if black had found those variations, he might have survived. However, he just took and now followed another brilliant tactical theme. White could give a check, but instead he came up with something even more brilliant. And this is actually another really common pattern you want to know what to do here as white. What forcing moves do we have? Okay, I hope you gave it some thought. The move I came up with is bishop takes h6. Now the idea is, if the black king were to take, the problem would be that white's now able to go check. Remember, we really wanted to include this bishop in, and now the squares on g6 and h7 are not available to black. And after black goes king g7, white's able to go knight f5 check, and if the black king goes wherever back, for example to h8, now comes another check, and this is going to be a checkmate on the next turn. It does not really matter where the black king goes. For example, here it would also end up chased, or white can go queen to g5 and mate the king anyway. And unfortunately, yeah, this is an absolute disaster. And so Anand tried to continue king to h8, but this did not help very much either, because white just brought the queen over. And now the question to you would be, where is the white queen going? Where would you like to see the white queen? Okay, I hope you gave it some thought. So the queen is unfortunately not able to checkmate black, let's say on this diagonal, because of the knight, which is defending h7. But black has a very open king, and had the queen been somewhere on the h-file, that would result in a disaster. And having understood that, calculated that in advance, Giri continued with the move queen f4. Not only is it attacking the knight, but also it's coming to h4. And after Anand continued queen d6, there followed queen h4. Now, white has a bunch of threats. For example, if black were to skip a turn, how do we win here as white? Okay, so there's definitely more than one way to win here. But for example, if you play such a move as bishop to f4, this is not only a check, but also it wins a queen. But also, frankly, we don't care about the queen because if, say, king g7, then just checkmate. Or if knight h7, then white's also able to checkmate black. But of course, if anything, the queen wouldn't hurt either. And so in this position, Anand tried capturing, but just ended up resigning right away. Because of course, if white just were to take back, this is a disaster. Black can give one more check, for example, but white can just hide the king. And next, moves like bishop to f8 or bishop to g5 or queen takes f6 everything results in black's position collapsing. And so, by far, the main takeaway from this game is that if white is able to bring one of the knights to f5 and hopefully be able to support it with the other knight, then the squares on g7 and h6 become incredibly vulnerable, and all kinds of sacrifices are immediately worth considering. Certainly this move or this move could be also definitely worth investigating. And another big takeaway is that very often retaining this bishop on the board is absolutely crucial if you want the attack to succeed. And so, remember, white found this move d4, making sure the bishop now gets into the attack. And in no small part, this is exactly what decided the outcome of this encounter. Now, hopefully, you are inspired enough to go and play and try to attack black in that way. Now you're not afraid of the d5 break anymore, or at least we know a lot more about the downsides of the break d5, which are weakening the pawn on e5 and often abandoning the ability to control the f5 square. And the very last thing I would say, and we'll see more of this discussion in the next games, but one last thing I want to say is that this is the knight overtakes. Now, admittedly, the bishop keeps controlling f5, but black no longer controls such a square as h5, for example, which could also be a huge problem. Very often the knight could come over to h5 or maybe even the queen. So that's also not that simple. I hope you're looking forward to giving these ideas a go in your games, and of course to seeing the next videos. And I appreciate you watching this. I'm looking forward to your feedback, and I will see you in the next video.